All right, guys, this is Standard 5 Part 1. Again, Standard 5 covers ecology and ecological relationships. So I'm going to break it up into two videos. This first part, I'm basically going to look at hierarchy levels of organization, the biogeochemical cycles, and the effects of carbon dioxide on the carbon cycle and how it affects things like climate change, global warming, and creates environmental problems due to an imbalance. All right, so basically, when we look at the levels of organization, when we talk about ecological organization, we're starting at the organism level. But prior to that, I want to make sure we understand how all of this actually comes together and the things that we've actually studied this year. Now, there are things smaller than subatomic particles called quarks, but we don't start there. That would be more like physics. But subatomic particles are going to be your protons, neutrons, and electrons. We know that those combine to make atoms. Atoms are basically in their purest form. You're going to have the elements if there's nothing but one type of atom there. So we have a periodic table of elements, and we know that there's a whole lot of different elements. Those elements come together to make compounds or molecules. And that really depends on the type of bonds that they form. If they're forming either ionic bonds or covalent bonds or metallic bonds, so that depends on whether or not they form these compounds or molecules or these formula units as well. And then those, you can have macromolecules, which are large molecules. Our macromolecules that we look at in biology 1, that's going to be our carbs, our lipids, our proteins, and we also look at our nucleic acids. So those are going to be our macromolecules that we looked at in biology 1. These macromolecules are produced by organelles, and organelles are things inside of cells that perform the task of those cells. For instance, one of the organelles that we look at is called a ribosome, and we know that ribosomes are actually used to assemble the amino acids which make proteins. All right, so then we have the organelles. The organelles are found inside of cells. Now, if I'm talking about a unicellular organism, it is composed of one cell. So then we'll go from the cell, which is then the organism, and then if I get a group of that same species in the same area at the same time, that's called a population. Then community, ecosystem, so forth and so on. But if I have a multicellular organism, then those cells are going to combine to make tissues, tissues make organs, organs make organ systems, and then I have a multicellular organism. Now, at the organism level, this is where we pick up with our ecological levels of organization. So again, an organism is actually like one individual of a specific species. And if I get a group of that one species living in the same area at the same time, I'm going to call that a population. Now, if I include all the different populations, so all of the biotic factors in that habitat, and that is called a community. Notice communities are only biotic factors, okay? So all the living things. So this would be like the prokaryotes. This would be your trees. This would be your animals, your fungus, your protista, which are all eukaryotes. And so we include all of the living things in that area, and that's a community. Now, if I take into account all of the abiotic factors along with the biotic factors, so now I'm going to talk about the water, I'm going to talk about the amount of sunlight, of the soil. When I start adding in the abiotic factors with the biotic factors, this is going to be an ecosystem. Now, each one of these organisms, they live in a specific area, and the area that they live in is called their habitat, okay? So a habitat is where they live. Now, what they do, their role within their ecosystem is their niche, okay? Kind of like if I was talking about earthworms, their habitat would be the dirt, their role would be to aerate the soil as decomposers. So within that ecosystem, the biotic things, they have an area where they live, which is their habitat, and then they have a niche or a role within that habitat. Now, if I start to include a larger area and I look at the types of flora, which are the plants and the fauna, which are the animals, as well as the weather or climate in a a large area, that's going to be called a biome. Biome can be aquatic or terrestrial. Aquatic meaning water, terrestrial meaning on land. So the aquatic biomes, we have moving water and we have still waters. Okay, these are different aquatic biomes. Terrestrial biomes would be things like a deciduous forest, which is where Mississippi is located in deciduous forest. We have deciduous trees that actually shed their leaves in the fall. Or you can have a coniferous forest, which have evergreens. You can have a taiga. Areas like Canada, which coniferous forests like are pretty much similar. You can have grasslands, which don't have a lot of, large trees. So there's several different biomes, land and water biomes. And then when you combine all those different biomes on Earth, you form what's called a biosphere. So the ecological levels of organization start with the organism and they go up to the biosphere, which is what we look at in Standard 5. We're looking at the relationship between these organisms and the interdependence amongst them and their habitat where they live. Now, one of the most important things we need to know is that in order for organisms to live, they need both nutrients and energy. And so nutrients can be recycled. The nutrients come from the elements that they're going to be, the things are made of, they're composed of. Nutrients can be recycled, but energy cannot. Energy flow is one directional. All energy enters the earth from the sun. It exits in the form of heat. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can be transformed or it can be transferred. And so we'll look at energy in video 2. And this one we're going to talk about the actual elements which form the nutrients. And we're going to look at some of, these are not all of, we're going to look at 4 of the biogeochemical cycles. Bio meaning life, geo, earth, chemical are the elements that we're going to specifically be looking at. And because our macromolecules, our carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, we're going to look at the water cycle, which is going to show us one way that hydrogen and oxygen are cycled. This is not the only way, it's just one way. We're going to look at the carbon cycle, we're going to look at the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Again, these are not the only biogeochemical cycles, just the ones we're going to focus on in Biology 1. All right, so the water cycle, the key parts of the water cycle are going to be precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, condensation, okay? Carbon cycle, the main 2 components of the carbon cycle are going to be photosynthesis and cellular respiration. If we look at the oxygen cycle, we will see they have the same main 2 processes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. The nitrogen cycle, the key to the nitrogen cycle is actually going to be prokaryotes or bacteria. They are key for this nitrogen cycle. And the phosphorus cycle is the only biogeochemical cycle that does not cycle through the atmosphere. So when we look at the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, we're going to talk about when water evaporates or transpires, it turns into water vapor, and it's going to be in the atmosphere. This water is going to cycle through the atmosphere, the earth, and living things. The carbon cycle, carbon dioxide puts carbon into the atmosphere. Again, it's going to cycle through the atmosphere and through living things and the earth. Nitrogen cycle, most of the air around us is actually atmospheric nitrogen or N2. And so we're going to talk about how this nitrogen cycles through the atmosphere, living things, and also the earth. But the phosphorus cycle, phosphate does not turn into a gas that is put into the atmosphere. The phosphorus cycle is the only cycle where the element will not cycle through the atmosphere. It will go through the earth and living things, but it will not go through the atmosphere. All right, so if we come over here, this is one big drawing, and we're going to look at the water cycle first, which is in red, okay? Water falls to the earth in the form of precipitation. That water is either going to run off into open bodies of water or it's going to be absorbed into the ground as groundwater. These open bodies of water, water is returned in the form of evaporation. When plants take in water from groundwater, water is actually returned to the air from plants, and that's called transpiration. So in both evaporation and transpiration, liquid water is transformed into water vapor and it goes back into the atmosphere where it undergoes condensation to form clouds, and once the clouds get saturated, it falls back to the earth in the form of precipitation again. Hail, sleet, snow, and rain, okay? Water cycle is pretty simple, right? Water is, the chemical formula for water is H2O, so this is showing us how hydrogen and oxygen is being cycled. Again, we're looking at the cycling of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus because our carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we know that this is formed through photosynthesis, and in photosynthesis, water is split so that the hydrogens can combine with carbon dioxide to make those carbohydrates. We're looking at the cycle of lipids, which are mostly carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The phospholipid also contains phosphate, which is contains phosphorus. Proteins, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Sometimes sulfur, but we're not looking at the sulfur cycle, so N. And nucleic acids, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So we're looking at those specific elements in these cycles. Now, the carbon cycle, the main two components of the carbon cycle are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So that's in purple. During photosynthesis, plants or autotrophs take in carbon dioxide along with the water, and they convert that inorganic carbon dioxide to sugars. And those sugars are then used by the plant or used by animals or other living things in order to transfer the energy from the bonds of the sugars into ATP. So carbon is removed from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, and it's going to be returned in the form of carbohydrates. Now, also plants do respiration, so plant respiration will put some carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as well. And then animals, of course, are going to take in carbon dioxide and the carbohydrates. Is how they actually, they're going to take in carbohydrates in the carbon cycle, and they're going to put out carbon dioxide through respiration. So the main two components of the carbon cycle are going to be photosynthesis, which removes carbon from the atmosphere, and respiration, which puts carbon back into the atmosphere. Now, other components of the carbon cycle, when these organisms die, decomposers like mushrooms or bacteria will actually break them down to put the carbon back into the earth. This forms fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels are mined and used in things like factories and cars and things like that. And then those, whenever you burn fossil fuels, the process is called combustion, and you put carbon back into the atmosphere. Now, the problem, I'm going to stop here for a second and talk about the problem with carbon dioxide imbalances. Carbon dioxide is one of several greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are things like carbon dioxide, methane, some hydrofluorocarbons, but we're worried about the carbon dioxide. Greenhouse gases actually trap heat in Earth's atmosphere, and that can lead to things like climate change, global warming, and environmental problems if there is an imbalance. Now, photosynthesis and cellular respiration were designed to keep the balance of carbon dioxide. One puts it into the atmosphere, the other one removes it from the atmosphere. But through the mining and burning of fossil fuels and destruction of habitats, human activities have created an imbalance where there's more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere than there is removal, because we're building factories that burn fossil fuels that put carbon dioxide into the air. At the same time, we're removing the autotrophs, which take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that leads to things like climate change, where we see these unusual weather patterns, global warming, where the average temperature of the Earth has increased, and also other environmental problems. Because as the average temperature of the Earth increases, your polar ice caps will melt. That running off from the polar ice caps cause ocean levels to rise, which will also flood coastal areas, and at the same time, because it's warmer than usual, inland areas are experiencing drought. So there is a domino effect by creating an imbalance of carbon dioxide and disrupting the carbon cycle. Main issue here, human activities. Now the nitrogen cycle, again, most of the atmosphere, most of the gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen, but we can't take that in from the atmosphere. So nitrogen can be fixed by either lightning striking, turning it into nitrates, or through bacteria, nitrogen fixing bacteria, which can change this nitrogen into ammonia, and other soil bacteria, which can change it into nitrates and nitrites. And then once this nitrogen has been fixed, plants can then take in the nitrogen and use it to build their proteins. And then we can get that nitrogen from eating those plants and breaking down their proteins into amino acids so that we can use those amino acids to build our proteins. Any nitrogen that is not used in the soil is then turned back into atmospheric nitrogen. So the three main components of the nitrogen cycle are going to be nitrogen fixation, nitrification, and denitrification. Again, decomposers are able to break down organisms, and so when decomposers put that nitrogen back into the soil as well. But the key organism to the nitrogen cycle is going to be bacteria. So bacteria is very useful in the nitrogen cycle. If we get rid of the soil bacteria and the nitrogen fixing bacteria, we will no longer be able to remove this nitrogen from the atmosphere or return it to the atmosphere in the nitrogen cycle. The last cycle is the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle is phosphates are found in rock, and so when rocks undergo weathering, they break down into this sediment, and some of the phosphate ends up in the soil, some of it ends up in water, but the key to the nitrogen cycle is that it's going to be found in sediment. The phosphates are found in sediment, and it does not cycle through the atmosphere. It is the only cycle that does not cycle through the atmosphere. Big picture here is knowing how to read the diagrams, okay? Knowing that the nitrogen cycle is dependent upon bacteria, the phosphorus cycle does not cycle through the atmosphere, and that the main two components of the carbon cycle are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That is it. Toodles.